Greetings. Glad that you can be with me today as we look at a sermon for August 13th, 2023. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, as well as the West Mineral Methodist Church in West Mineral, Kansas. We'll be looking at Genesis chapter 37 and looking at verse 3, 4, 12, and 13. It's kind of a story about Joseph, and we all know a little bit of the story about Joseph because we know Joseph of his coat in many colors, and that'll be referred to here a little bit, but doesn't really it doesn't play a big part in the story that we're going to be looking at today. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons because he had been born in his old age, and he made richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flock near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. Well, we know there's a lot more to that story. That kind of told a little part of it there, that Joseph's father had given him this special coat, that he had a special, treated Joseph a little bit better than his other sons. He had 11 other sons. And he kind of treats Joseph special. Well, the others, of course, are jealous of this and said that they hated him. And they hated him so much that when he does arrive to them, finds them where they're grazing their flocks, they have a plot together to kill Joseph. And then one of the brothers says, well, why don't we there's a well here, dry well, why don't we just throw him in there? And of course he has in the back of his mind, he'll come back and rescue him later. It just so happens that a caravan comes along that's headed toward Egypt. And then they get an idea, hey, why kill him? Why don't we just sell him to these traders that are on their way to Egypt, and we can make some money on the deal. That way we get rid of him, and we make a little money on the side. So that's what they do, and then they take his coat, the special coat that his father had made for him, put animal blood on it, and then when they go back home, they say, oh, we're sorry you're here, but an animal has killed Joseph. And his father believes this story. So that's kind of everything that takes place in this. One time a pastor was talking to a little boy that was learning how to count. And the little boy, the pastor thought, well, he'd test him. He says, can you tell me what comes after 3? And he said, well, yeah, 4. Well, what comes after 8? 9. And so, no, now can you tell me what comes after 10? And he goes, Jack. And then Queen, then King, then Ace. He had learned from playing cards, right? So we all learn things different ways. And each family has their own way of doing things. A term that we sometimes today use to describe families that have problems is we say they are dysfunctional, right? To say the least, in the passage today, this family is dysfunctional. And one, it wasn't right for Jacob, who is here called Israel. Wasn't right for him to treat one son better than the others. So there's that situation. And gives him this special robe. That doesn't create very much harmony in the family. And to make things even worse, Joseph at one time has a dream where all these things are different sheaves of grain are bowing down to him and other things like that. And he makes it sound like, hey, the family is to bow down to him. He's special. And he kind of makes a deal about that, kind of takes advantage of that. So they have the bad feelings, and then they conspire to kill him, which is pretty dysfunctional in itself. And we hear stories every once in a while of family members that do kill other family members. It's a sad thing to see that sometimes a grandparent kills a grandson, or a grandson kills the grandfather, or a parent kills a child, or a child kills a parent. We see that every once in a while. We wonder, how in the world could people do something like that? Wow. I grew up watching a lot of TV shows about families, right? It was kind of a common thing back in the 60s and the 70s, and there was like Leave It to Beaver, had a pretty much, what you'd think, then a normal family, right? They had mom and dad and 2 kids. Pretty normal family, right? But then there were other shows, like My 3 Sons. Had a man that had 3 sons, but no wife. Bonanza. Again, 3 sons, no wife. And then there was the Andy Griffith Show, right? Andy raising this son on his own. Of course, had Aunt Bee there, but still, not a traditional family in that sense. But they still functioned fairly well. They, had their moments, and then there were other shows that came along, like the Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family. And again, they weren't necessarily traditional families. They kind of had some part there. One was a combined family, and others were a single mother trying to raise these children, right? But they're all pretty normal and function fairly well, until somebody decided to break the mold, right? Along came All in the Family with Archie Bunker. That was not a normal, regular family. I mean, they did have the normal, regular family. Archie and Edith and had their daughter, but then along came the son-in-law, and Archie was not he wasn't Ward Cleaver, right? Archie was bigoted and very opinionated about things. He was not, and he didn't treat his son-in-law all that well. Yep, there was always differences there. And then another one that came along was Roseanne. They'd had what we call a traditional family. They had the mom and the dad and the kids, but they were not Leave It to Beaver, because Roseanne was not, June Cleaver would vacuum the carpet and wear a dress and pearls. Roseanne did not wear dresses, and she didn't wear pearls. And she probably didn't even vacuum. So, totally different family situation. But the thing is, we probably knew more people that had the Roseanne type family than the ones that had the Leave It to Beaver family. They were actually closer to the truth. I mean, you probably knew more people like Archie Bunker than Ward Cleaver. So, yeah. And of course, there's other ones like Everybody Loves Raymond, where they had the traditional family, but it was dysfunctional too. They had problems with the parents coming over all the time, and some of the different things that they had to deal with, and the differences between the 2 brothers. So, yeah, they weren't totally functional either. But then again, is any family really perfect? No. All families are, we might say, dysfunctional in a way. Maybe some more than others, but we all have our moments. We all have our problems. And as I've read, some of the commentaries on this particular passage, it'll be interesting that you see the blame given to different people in the story. Some blame Jacob, the father, for being too passive and playing favorites, and then others say Joseph was too arrogant. and brought it on himself. Another blames the brothers for having hatred in their hearts. You know, the thing is not one of them is totally without blame here. You know, Jacob made mistakes, Joseph made mistakes, his brother made mistakes, and that's kind of the way a lot of things are sometimes. It isn't one thing that causes the problem. It usually multiple layers of things. I remember a friend of mine used to say, wherever you go, there you are. And you go, yeah, that doesn't sound all that profound. Wherever you go, there you are. But the idea is that sometimes if you think, if I can just get to have a different job, or if I have a different spouse, or if I have a different community that I live in, my problems will go away. Only to find out when you get to that new place or that new job or have that new spouse, the same old problems come back, because wherever you go, there you are. That you might be part of the problem. You know, a lot of times pastors have problems in a certain church, and they go to the district superintendent and they say, oh, you've got to get me a new church. I just can't get along with these people. So they move to a new church, and after a while, the same thing happens. They go to the district, you know, I can't get along with these people. You got to give me a different church. And it keeps happening again and again. And they got to realize, wherever you go, there you are. It may not necessarily be the people that are causing the problem. But the same thing can happen with houses, right? With spouses, or jobs, churches, friends. A lot of times, somebody, you know, like I say, don't. If you ever find the perfect church, don't join it. It won't be perfect anymore, right? And that's kind of the way it is. There's a story about a man one time was alone on a deserted island for several years, and finally a ship comes along to rescue him, and they see 3 huts. And they say, well, why are there 3 huts? He says, well, one I live in and one I go to church in. He says, yeah, but there's 3. Why are there 3? He says, well, I didn't like that church anymore, so I went to the other one. Oh, people are like that. And you wonder, where is God? When we read this story, you mentioned it talks about Jacob and how he felt, and Joseph and what he was doing, and the brothers. And where's God in this whole thing? Did any of them consult God and say, where? Now, Joseph eventually does. I mean, you know, when he does get off into Egypt into slavery, he does seek out God's help when he is there. But up to this point, there really doesn't seem to be much emphasis on God. Wow. One thing about it is we can choose our friends, the people we want to associate with and want to deal with, but our family is our family. And a lot of times we're going to have, you know, disagreements. We're going to have things that are not where we're not going to get along, but they're still our family, aren't they? Whether we get along or not. And of course, you know, there's some families that the people do ignore each other and they don't get along. But then there's their families that, despite our differences, despite our different ways of looking at things, we can still function as a family. We can still do the things that need to be done. And it's not just families. Because we can think of the church sometimes as a family, a local church. It's kind of sometimes a lot like a family. And we're going to have differences from time to time. We're going to have different ways of looking at things, different ways of seeing things, but the thing is that we're all one in the body of Christ, that we're all part of God's family together. And it helps if we can work those things out and agree, maybe to disagree, and move on and do the things that we need to do. Now, of course, we know the rest of the story, don't we? what eventually happens with Joseph and his brothers, that as the years go by, eventually they come back together again. We have to deal with that. And forgiveness has to take place. And that's part of the whole thing too, is trying to be able to forgive one another and to take part and to allow healing to take place. And the lesson that this not only applies to our families, but also to the, I might say, the workplace. A lot of times in the workplace, we're thrown together with other people that we may not necessarily see eye to eye on sometimes, but might be that we really need this job and we really need the income, and we need to find some way to work things out, get along. We'll probably disagree once in a while, but hopefully we can find a way, or in school even, or dare I say, the church. But there's sometimes that we have our little disagreements and need to find a way to get along with one another. And forgive each other. I've often wondered sometimes, especially in small towns, might go to a small town that only has a few hundred people, and yet there'll be multiple churches in that town. And why? Why do there have to be, we can see a few differences here and there, the theological differences and things like that. But why do there have to be so many? There might be a small town that maybe has 1,000 people in the town, and there'll be 8 churches in that small town. Why do they have to 8 churches? Because by and large, they're probably preaching basically the same message, that Jesus Christ is our Savior and Lord, and through Him we have our salvation, that we are to love one another and care for one another, that the basic teaching that practically every church is going to have. Now, there may be some other emphases here and there. There may be differences in worship style, or maybe baptism and the way that we do that, but still pretty close to the same a lot of times. And we wonder, why are there so many? Why can't they? Well, of course, time brings that on as well. But part of the reason is people couldn't get along. And so they decided to have their own different church somewhere else so that they didn't have to deal with those people. Yeah. It happens. It happens. But the idea is here, as we look at the story of Joseph and his brothers and how they had their disagreements, and the good news is that they did overcome in the end. It took several years, but eventually they got to the point where they could forgive and let the bad feelings go to the wayside and accept one another as brothers. And that we oftentimes need to do those things too. Well, I hope that today was a blessing, and that we can get something out of this, and hope that the Lord will continue to be with us, to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.